This is a pleasure for me to be giving this talk. It's a special pleasure to give it at Florida State, although I'm not there physically, and I wish I were there. But as I said, it was a special pleasure because I spent more than 2 years there a long time ago, and I still remember them very fondly. I will speak today, as you see from the title, about global income inequality, about its historical evolution, and also its future. So let me, when I start with historical evolution, I would start actually with what happened during the past 30 to 40 years. Although we do have the data also from the 19th century even, but obviously they are much more tentative than what we have now for the most recent period. So the past 30 years have actually witnessed what I call the greatest reshuffle of individual income positions since the Industrial Revolution. I have to explain that. The reshuffle actually means that individuals from different countries and individuals from different parts of the income distributions of those different countries have had the one level or one position at the beginning of the 1980s, and they now have ended up with different position in 2020s. Let me give you a very simple example to understand what I mean. If you were, for example, in the fifth decile, which means in the middle of the income distribution in urban China in 1978, you probably would have been only better off than 20% of the world population. But if a different person, obviously today, is exactly at that same point in China, in the middle of the urban income distribution, that person would be now placed probably somewhere at the 85th percentile of the global income distribution. So that means that that individual has really moved significantly up in the global income distribution. But that also means that people who in the past were at the 80th percentile of the global income distribution are now much more at a different position and much lower placed than they were in the past. So this was this big reshuffle where obviously China and India and Indonesia played a huge role. But also it was the reshuffle that redefined the position of the middle class in many Western and richer societies. And it did redefine it not necessarily in the way that was actually good for the Western middle classes. I do start, and as I think many of us do, with what may be called the watershed years. These are the years between 1978 and 1991, which, as you see on the slide, were the years where huge changes in the world politically and economically happened. That was a decade within, or actually 13 years, if you really count them very carefully, within which Western Europe, USA, China, Russia, Eastern Europe, and India really started living under a very different system than before. Now, the countries and the regions that I mentioned include 60% of the world population. So within broadly a decade, we had a significant change in Western countries that with privatization, deregulation. We had the changes in Eastern European countries and the Soviet Union with the end of the planned economy. We had liberalization in India, and of course, we had an introduction of a market system in China, which actually really happened approximately the same time when Thatcher and Reagan came to power in the United States and the UK. Now, what the changes within this 20 or 30 years happened, they were, if they're reflected in what you might call the emergence of the global middle class. Sometimes actually I call it the global median class, because when we speak of the middle class, particularly in rich countries, we actually have an idea of what is the global class in the United States or in rich countries, but that's not what the global middle class is in the world. People in the world, obviously, which are in the middle of the income distribution, are much poorer than people in the US that are in the middle class. However, what you see on this graph is that if you compare 1988 with 2011, or actually if you were to compare it with 2021, for which we don't have the data yet, but I will say something towards the end of my speech when I talk about that, we do notice a remarkable change. We have now many more people in the middle of the income distribution, global income distribution, than in 1988. In 1988, you had essentially the world divided in some sense in two groups. The economist Inequality called that the twin peaks. There was a very large group of people, as you can see here, around $1,000 per capita per year, which is of course not very much in terms of per day. It's like less than $3 in purchasing power parity, international dollars per day. And these are people mostly from Asian countries. And we had a second peak, which is much smaller, but it was still noticeable at about like $20,000 per year per person in disposable income in rich countries. Now, that has actually changed in a sense that we have many more people in the red line, if you look at the red distribution, now than in the middle than we used to have in the past. And this is really where the growth of Asian countries has been reflected in the global income distribution. I have to explain a little bit this graph also to mention that what you see here, although I make it sound simpler when I speak of countries, but in reality, behind this graph are actually individuals. These are individuals positioned in their position in the income distribution of their own country. So as I was saying before, I took the example of the person who is in the middle of the income distribution in China. You have behind each of these slides, behind each of these graphs, you have something which like 130 countries with each of them 100 percentiles of the income distribution. So you have the average income of each percentile, and you put all of these percentiles in the global income distribution. As you can see, if you have 130 countries with 100 percentile, that would give you something like 13,000 data points. And then you convert the incomes, which are originally expressed in national currencies, you convert them into a global currency, if you will, which is called international dollar, or the PPP dollar, which is purchasing power parity dollar, which in principle has the same purchasing power anywhere in the world. That means that you do account for the difference in the price level between countries where the price level is low, like India, and countries like the price level is very high, like Japan. So you do have an adjustment for that, obviously by boosting the incomes in India to reflect the fact that people can actually buy food, for example, in India, much more cheaply in Japan, and you reduce then incomes in Japan to reflect exactly the fact that housing or food or other goods are more expensive. So that means that you actually come with a numeraire, with a unit, which in principle is equally powerful, or can buy the same amount of goods and services anywhere in the world. So this is what is behind this seemingly very simple curve that you can see here, which actually includes many more data points and includes a much more nuanced view of the world than simply countries. So this was, of course, what is, as I said, behind the change. That's the most dramatic sort of reflection of the change, is the different positions of Asian countries with respect to Western countries. You see here the share of on the left side graph, you see the share of the US and China in the global income, global GDP. This is now measured in terms of the GDP, again, expressed in the same units of international dollars. And you do notice that by about 2015, expressed in international dollars, Chinese overall GDP exceeds the US GDP. Now, obviously, it doesn't make China a richer country, on a per capita basis because the Chinese population is 3 times as large. So on a per capita basis, obviously, the incomes in China are just 1/3 approximately of the incomes in the US. But it still illustrates very, dramatic changes that happen in the most recent period. On the next slide, next to it, actually, you see the same sort of evolution between the GDPs of Germany and India. So India currently, or actually more exactly before the coronavirus crisis, represented something like 8% of the GDP. And as you can see now in the 1980s, which was the low point of Indian relative development, India's share in the global GDP was only 3%. If you compare it with Germany, unified Germany, in the 1990s, Germany represented only about 5% of the global GDP, and nowadays that number has gone down to 3%. So this is simply to illustrate the dramatic changes in the distribution of economic activity which happened in the world over the last 30 years, and which are indeed are reflected in that slide that I showed before with the emergence of the global middle class, which is basically, for all intents and purposes, an Asian global middle class. Now, that Asian global middle class, by sort of becoming richer, had a dramatic effect also on the position of the Western middle classes, to which I alluded previously. If you do the following calculation, where you put everybody in the world again in his or her percentile in the global income distribution and put that on the horizontal axis from number 1, which is the poorest people in the world, which are actually by the World Bank standards below the absolute poverty line. Currently, that absolute poverty line is about $2 per person per day. So this is really basically subsistence level. So if you put them from the left, where actually that would be the poorest people in the world at the number 1, and then you move all the way to the top global income percentile, which would be the richest people in the world, that would be the number 100. And on the vertical axis, you look at the change in their per capita income, expressed, as I was explaining before, in international dollars. And you look at the percentage change between 1988 and 2008. This graph, which many of you might have seen, and it goes under the name of the elephant chart because it kind of looks like an elephant with its elevated trunk. You notice, and actually I would like to highlight first what I called for simplicity, China's middle class. You see that people who are around the 60th global percentile have had a very strong growth in their per capita incomes. This is 80% on the average, but if I were to single out China in that group, or Chinese middle deciles, the increase is actually much more substantial. It's like 200% or even 300%. But if you put everybody who is in that middle group, which includes people from Thailand, Vietnam, China, India, Indonesia, and so on, and also other people, this could be people behind that, you could be percentiles from, countries like Costa Rica, Chile, and elsewhere, you have an average which is about 80% growth over these 20 years. But then the interesting part, and why this graph became so widely quoted, is if you move towards richer people who are at the 80th global percentile, because mind you, wants to remind you, the Chinese group in the middle is only at the 60th percentile. Now, if you move towards the richer people who are the 80th global percentile, which again, for simplicity, I call the US lower middle class, what you notice there that there was almost no growth in real terms for that group. Now, obviously, that group doesn't include the US middle class or lower middle class out. It includes 2 important countries where also the lower part of the income distribution did not see much in terms of real growth. This is Japan and Germany. So if you take US, Japan, and Germany, you have something like 500 million people there. If you take lower parts of their income distributions, you have something like 250 million people. So it's a lot of people who had relatively modest increases in their real income, and particularly modest if you compare that with dramatic increases in many of Asian countries. So that's why we have this quasi-zero rate of growth during the 20 years. And as I will show in a minute, actually, that particular position of the Western countries' middle classes did not really improve in the next period all the way to the pandemic. And then at the very top, of course, you have an interesting development. As you see now, if you go to the 100th percentile, which is really at the very sort of right end of the slide, you have really a very significant increases in real income, which were enjoyed by the richest 1% of people in the world. Now, that group, of course, is not small. We are talking about 70 million people, because 1% of the global income distribution includes something like 70 million people, or even nowadays almost 80 million people. And there is a significant increase in terms of percentage growth. But what is even more important is that if you look at their absolute gains, they were very substantial. The reason why they were so important is because the income level at the global top 1% is very high. So if you have 70% increase of that very high income level, in absolute terms, it would be really a very, very large gain, much greater than, of course, the gain that China's middle class has realized in absolute terms. So this equivalency in relative terms translates, of course, in a much bigger gains among the people who are richer to start with. So that's the slide, I think, is quite important because it illustrates, to summarize, three important developments that happened during the high sort of points of globalization. First, it was the rise of the global middle class. Second, slow growth or absence of growth of many middle classes in the rich parts of the world. And third, very good period and significant growth of the incomes of the top 1%. So these are really the three most salient developments of that period of high globalization, the period in the past 30 or 40 years. So after the financial crisis, if I do the same slide, it is less dramatic because you see that there was no elevated trunk at the top of the income distribution, which existed in the past. The reason for that is that global top 1%, which is still composed mostly of people in Western countries, really was affected by the global financial crisis. So their growth rate in the US was actually negative during the global financial crisis. Then there was a recovery after 2010, but that recovery essentially simply compensated for the loss of income immediately after the financial crisis. But what you do notice is that the very strong growth around the global median continued. So that particular development did not change. And there was no improvement for the Western middle classes. In other words, they continued to have a relatively sluggish growth rate. I have to mention a thing which is a little bit complicating the interpretation of the graphs. First is that this is all based on household surveys, which do not include the richest people in the world. And very often there is an underestimation of the income of the very top 1%. So I do try to adjust for that. The blue line adjusts for this. But even when we adjust for that the best that we can, we still do not find a significant growth rate in the period after the financial crisis to the extent that it could match the growth rate at the top 1% before the crisis. So you notice that this blue line is higher than the non-adjusted line, which is based only on household surveys, which is the red line, but there was no really significant difference between the two. The second point that I wanted to mention is that the reshuffling in the income distribution means that even if the same trends continue in the future, you will not necessarily see the same shape of the graph. The reason is that Asian middle classes would gradually move, and they're moving in what you can call the Western middle class territory. In other words, when Chinese middle classes become sufficiently rich to overtake some people who are in the lower middle class in the US, they would actually move in the terrain of 80, 85th of the 90th percentile. And this is really what we are already witnessing. And consequently, people in Germany or Italy or Spain would move down. So then the Asian growth, if it continues in the next 20 years, would be really more and more reflected not around the 60th percentile, but more around the 75th or 80th or 85th percentile, simply because of the reshuffling in the relative positions. I want to mention that because I want to emphasize that even if the underlying movements continue the way that they are now, we will not have the same elephant chart in the future simply because of the changes in the positions between different groups of people. And of course, the point that I already mentioned, I'm just bringing it up again, is the slowdown of growth of the global top 1%. Now, who are these global top 1%? Despite the rise of Asia, the very top of the income distribution is still heavily dominated by the rich countries because they are still, of course, much richer. And moreover, in countries with unequal income distribution, the top of those countries, especially the case in the United States, is very rich. So if you take the global top 1% by income in 2013, and the same situation is 2018, which are the most recent data before the coronavirus, you have almost 1/3 of the people in the global top 1% coming from the United States. That also sort of shows you the ambivalence of the slogan, "We are 99%," because when that slogan is made in the US, oftentimes these are the people who may be 99% in the US, but since the United States is a rich country, 11% of Americans are part of this global top 1%. So you might actually believe that you are 99% and distinguish yourself from the top 1%, but you can be still part of the global top 1%. In other words, people who are actually globally rich are many Americans, as you can see here, almost 32 million of them, who are not only in the American global top 1%, but they're, in the American top 1%, but in the American second percentile or third or fifth and so on, all the way to the top 11% of the US population. As you notice there are of course other countries which are also represented with significant number of people in the global top 1%. Japan comes number 2, China is next, Germany then follows, then Russia, Great Britain, and so forth. But their importance is still much smaller. Now, as we move towards the present, and of course there we have problems with the accessibility to the Chinese data, which I will not talk about now, but we certainly have many fewer data from China than in the past. We still can actually sort of estimate what happens today, and that means that essentially the percentage of people or the number of people from China who are part of the global top 1% would become larger, or it has already become larger. As you see from the title in the slide, the numbers here that are shown are a number of people in million from each of those countries that are part of the global top 1%. So whereas 10 years ago, there was 3.6 million people from China who are in the global top 1%. It's very likely that that number is now 5 or 6 million, but it's still lower than the number of the Americans who are in global top 1%. As you can see, it's almost 32 million of them. Now, that difference between rich countries and middle-income countries and poorer countries still remain, and it's very striking when you put it in the following terms. What you see here is on the horizontal axis, you take people from, we start with the United States first, we take people in their position in their own country. So if I take the red line and I say to somebody, I find a person with a median, which is the income level in the United States, which divides exactly the US population into 50% of people would be poorer than that individual, and 50% would be richer. And I say, okay, so I take you with your income, and you're like number 50 on the horizontal axis, and I ask, where are you in the global income distribution? And there, if I were to ask this question from that person, he or she would probably guess that he or she must be higher than the 50th percentile in the global income distribution, simply because the US is a rich country. So if you're in the middle of the US income distribution, you're likely to be higher than the middle in the global income distribution. This is what you see here. Actually, the person with the middle in the middle of the US income distribution would be somewhere like the 90th percentile in the global income distribution. And even very poor people in the United States would be at the 60th percentile in the global income distribution. And if you go all the way to the top, in the top right corner, you notice what I said before, is that the 10% of the US income distribution, the highest 10 or 11%, would be part of the global income, global top 1%. Now, you can contrast this, for example, with urban China, which of course is much poorer at any individual percentile, but as you notice at the very top, Chinese top 1% is now rejoining also the global top 1%. If you take then China rural, you notice very large difference between urban China and rural China. To give you an example, the average income in urban China is equal to the average income in Hungary, or it's probably even higher than the average income of Hungary today. But the average income in rural China is equal to the income level of Vietnam. So China, to a large extent, is almost like two countries, one middle income or higher middle income, which is the urban areas, and one really very much lower middle income, which is in rural areas. You also notice that at the very bottom, poorest people in Chinese rural areas are very poor. So it's actually there at the 10th percentile in the global income distribution, very low in global income distribution. So here is the position of India urban income distribution, which is low, but at the very top of Indian income distribution, you see the rich Indians also rejoining the global top 1%. And finally, here is the rural India, which is relatively poor throughout the income distribution. And not surprisingly, of course, very poor people in rural India are also among the poorest people in the world. At the very end, I want to show you how countries that are very unequal look like. The example that I use here is Brazil, but of course I could have used South Africa or any other very unequal country, which does include also very poor people. So what you notice here in the case of Brazil is that the people at the bottom of Brazilian income distribution are also people who are at the bottom of the global income distribution. And people who are at the top of the Brazilian income distribution are people who are also at the top of the global income distribution. So essentially, Brazil or South Africa would be countries that would span the entire global income distribution. They are also, to some extent, good to sort of see within a country how the world looks like. So essentially, they mimic the global income distribution by having very poor people, by having a middle class, and also by having very rich people. That's not necessarily good for the country itself, because as you can see here, it really includes different worlds within itself, and it includes very poor people and very rich people, but it does actually show us how the global income distribution is extremely unequal. So let me then sort of summarize this and say a few words about what we can now expect with COVID. The most important developments are things that I already mentioned, so I will go very quickly over that. First of all, that actually for the first time in 2 centuries, Western lower middle classes will no longer be in the top global quintile. Quintile includes 20% of people. So because of that great reshuffling, some of that would be pushed down in the global income distribution. The global top percentiles would be increasingly populated by Asian population because of much higher rate of growth. And in some extent, what they call there was a long march of the Chinese population through the global income distribution, moving obviously towards the higher parts of the global income distribution, including global top 1%. So this would have, of course, many impacts, including political impact, including the effect on the consumption patterns between the different parts of the income distribution and different parts of the global or geographical distribution. That would also mean that we can actually expect in the future very rich Atlantic and Pacific coasts, which for the Eurasian landmass means that they could remain relatively poor, particularly that actually applies to Russia and Central Asian countries. And then finally, a very important development in the future is an increasing income gap between Europe and Africa. Now, I have not spoken much of Africa now. Actually, I don't think I even mentioned Africa so far, because it has not played a huge role in global income distribution. However, Africa is a continent that is growing in terms of population, the only continent actually that is growing, and it's growing at a very high rate in excess of 2% per annum. And it's also a continent that has failed to converge in terms of incomes. So the issue in the future will be whether the sort of the shape of the global income distribution would continue the way that we have seen it in the past, or whether the growth rates of African population would really mean any absence of convergence would really mean that we would have more and more people who are poor at the bottom of income distribution, and they will be dominated really by poor Africans. That has huge implications for migration and the relationship between Europe and Africa. But it would, of course, affect the United States as well, simply because of the large importance of African populations. Now, what can we say for the effect of COVID-19? First, it's actually still too early to tell, because first, we are still in the midst of hopefully moving towards the end of the pandemic, but that's not obvious because we believed also that we were moving towards the end of the pandemic several months ago. Secondly, the data always come with a delay. So we really do not have distributional data with the exception of the couple of countries. We don't know how COVID has affected income distribution in India. We, of course, believe that, and we know that mortality and morbidity rates among the poor in most countries have been higher than morbidity and mortality rates among the middle class and the rich. But we don't know what happened to incomes. For example, in many European countries and possibly in the United States, inequality might have actually gone down due to the large expenditures that were undertaken by the governments, to the extent of 20% of GDP that was actually paid in the support. So we really do not know yet the effects of COVID. But we know that also we have been very wrong originally when, as I mentioned here, when we try to kind of guess what would be the effect of COVID on different countries, our forecasts were very much made nonsense of by the effects of the pandemic. So we currently do know, however, that Chinese growth continued more or less unabated for, in 2020 and 2021. And there were actually substantial declines in real income in India, and there were substantial declines in real income in Western countries. Then there was a rebound. But the negative effects, and something which actually does worry me quite a lot, is that India might not go back to its sort of pre-COVID path, which would have a very significant negative effect on global inequality and also on global poverty. On the other hand, Africa, as I was saying before, might not converge. And this is a question of the longer term, not only about 2 years now, but in the future. And that also would increase global poverty and global inequality. So to conclude, we have a really, I think, a significant watershed period with the COVID-19. It has affected global growth rates. It has affected growth rates practically of every country in the world. It has made growth much less than it would have been otherwise. It has increased global poverty. And as to its effect on global inequality, it is an ambivalent effect that we still do not know well. If China does continue growing, and it is now past the point in the middle of the global income distribution, China would paradoxically contribute to global inequality. And I have to mention that again, because we have sort of become used to China having a sort of a benign effect on global inequality because it is originally a poor country that is growing. Well, now it's no longer a poor country, and if it continues growing at high growth rates, it would, and it is already, making the distance between herself and India and Nigeria or Ethiopia or other large countries larger. So paradoxically, China will add to global income inequality. Likewise, paradoxically, the slowdown of growth in Western nations is contributing to reduce global income inequality simply because these countries are very rich, and by becoming less rich, they're actually reducing global income inequality. So these are not necessarily good developments, as you can see there, particularly not for the middle classes in the Western countries that might remain affected by globalization, and especially now with globalization of labor that is made possible by ability of working from distant locations. So to conclude, I'm not particularly optimistic about the future developments, given the developments also in political relations between China and the United States, absence of growth in Africa, and very much uncertainty about what will happen in India in the future. And we do have a break in the trend which came with COVID and with the trade war between the US and China. And the developments in the future might be much less, in my opinion, much less optimistic and positive than they were in the last 30 years. And finally, they are unlikely to improve, I think, position of the Western middle classes compared to the period of the last 20 or 30 years. So I have to say that I see the situation in rather gloomy lights for the future, much sort of more pessimistically so than I would have seen it in the early 21st century. So thank you very much again for your attention, and thank you for giving me opportunity to present some parts of my work.